As we discussed in the last section, in 1826, Naples, in France, created the first permanent image. At the same time, in England, Henry Fox Talbot was independently working on developing a method of creating a photograph as well. By 1834, he created permanent negative images using paper soaked in silver chloride and fixed with a salt solution. He later patented this method as the collotype. Henry Fox Talbot is often credited with being the first aesthetic or art photographer, meaning that he was not only concerned with the scientific development of photography, but also with the composition of the images. The general term for this method of creating a photograph is called the wet plate method, because each plate for capturing the image had to be coated just before taking the picture and developed immediately afterwards. The important thing to remember about early photography is the length of the exposure. The exposure of the first image is said to have taken 8 hours. The exposure time quickly improved with better lenses and better chemical solutions to 1 hour, then to 15 minutes, and then down to a minute, which is still a very long time for taking a photograph. We now measure exposure times in hundreds and thousands of seconds. Still, if you wanted to take a picture of a person, it helped if they were sleeping, as in this Henry Fox Talbot image. In this landscape photograph, also by Talbot, notice that there are no people visible. It is not because there were no people, but because the exposure time was so long that the people blurred into nothingness before the exposure was finished. Using a similar idea, the contemporary photographer, Ada Kim, creates 8-hour exposures in famous places, for instance, Times Square. Back in France, Louis Daguerre was a partner with Napes, and by 1837 he had developed his own method of creating positive images on silver-plated copper coated with silver iodide and developed with warmed mercury. While dangerous, this was a pretty stable method for creating a photograph, the downside being that each photograph was a piece of silver-coated copper, which was expensive, and you couldn't make copies. The French government awarded Daguerre a state pension for publishing his method, thus allowing others to use the daguerreotype process. So while Talbot placed a patent on his process and would sue others for using his method, the daguerreotype method was free to use and therefore became the most popular method of capturing images for several years, both in Europe and in the United States. In 1839, Samuel Morse, a famous American painter and inventor, met Louis Daguerre in France and returned to the United States to enthusiastically promote the new daguerreotype invention. In 1851, in England, Frederick Scott Archer improved the resolution of the photograph by spreading a mixture of collodion and chemicals on sheets of glass. The use of glass negatives instead of paper was an improvement on Talbot's collotype. This not only allowed higher quality, but was also much less expensive than daguerreotypes and allowed for unlimited reproductions, since it was working from a negative. This invention was an important step towards photography becoming a business, and it was essentially the end of the daguerreotype. So, by 1853 in France, Nadar, which is actually a made-up name, opens a portrait studio in Paris and begins photographing the rich and famous of the Paris scene, many of whom were his friends. What really sets Nadar apart is the quality of his portraits. In this image of Sarah Bernhardt, a famous actress of the time, notice the beautiful soft light coming in from the right, how the folds of the cloth are illuminated as though she were standing by a window. Also in this photograph of Georges Sand, a famous author, the lighting and exposure, though a little harsher and not as natural, are perfect. And in this shot, notice how the darks and lights are used to move the eye around the image.